we're going to go exactly the same as before. Thank you, Richard. I think you've put the recording on. But we will be recording from now on. If you have a question, please put it in the chat box. So this is a series of question and answer sessions with people about the decisions relating to the selection of the option E for East-West Rail and circumstances around that decision, and also some of the developments that have arisen since then. In this session, we're joined by Will Gallagher, who is the strategy director of East-West Rail Company. Will, you're very welcome. Thank you very much for coming.
Good to be here.
And we're going to have a series of questions, and I'm going to start with Mike Barlow. And if anyone who isn't down as someone who's a listed question, if you have a question, please put it in the chat box and we'll get to you later. Mike, you've got a slide I think you want to share with us.
Yeah, just the one for my first question, then I'll take it down. Can you see that okay?
Yes.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so the pre-consultation costings communicated to the consultees were very different from the post-consultation costings, which weren't communicated. So a difference of between 50 and 80% for routes A to D, but not for route E. These cost changes were fundamental to the route decision, as they altered significantly the benefit-cost ratio for each route and therefore the decision for route E. What independent review of these cost changes did East-West Rail commission, given the likely implication for the change of the preferred route? And what changes, if any, have been made in the estimated cost for route E? What is the source and the assessed amount of these changes?
Should I kick off?
Yeah,
if you could, and I think we can take the slide down now.
I'm trying to find out how. Oh yeah, there it is. Stop share, right? Got it.
I think Will will be familiar with the numbers. Yes, Will, off you go.
Yeah, so look, we I think the first thing to say is in relation to the way we sort of selected the preferred route option, we looked at a set of 15 assessment factors. Capital cost is one of those. But it isn't the only factor driving the decision, but it is a significant one. I think that's certainly fair to say. As we set out at consultation on when we publish those numbers, we put this information into the public domain, noting that these costs were going to increase in maturity over time. We were consulting at an early stage, and also that not all costs were at precisely the same level of maturity, and our aim was to, by the time we came to select a preferred route option, to get to the point where they were all at the same level of maturity. So we did see some cost changes over that period of time. There's a variety of reasons for those cost changes, but I think it's probably worth saying that route E was at that point at a sort of higher level estimate in terms of the level of detail that we had for that route option, and as we built up that detail, that did sort of that changed the the sort of ranking on the costs, and in terms of the things that were sort of driving that, I think the first thing is that we were looking at, one, as you get more detail and you get into sort of a deeper understanding of how much viaduct, how much earthworks, all of those things in route E, we got to a more detailed view on the costs, so a sort of a baseline, a more detailed baseline from which to work. And then in terms of things that were affecting a set of all routes, but you would have different effects on different routes because of their different characteristics. So for example, routes that went through more floodplains, where historically some assumptions had been made that actually we didn't need viaducts in all of those, we took we took a more realistic assumption that we were going to need viaducts. We also had a look at earthworks costs and the assumptions around how much cut and fill that you were going to need. So, for example, based upon an understanding of some of the geotechnical data, kind of getting into a bit more detail on how much of the earth we could reuse. And again, depending on the topography that you're operating in, that changes the overall level of costs. And also, when we looked at Bedford and our interaction with the existing rail network going through Bedford, those routes also, as we understood what the likely interaction between East West Rail and the existing network and the existing sidings in particular there, that also influenced our view on costs. So when you take all of those things in the round, that got us to a set of costs at the preferred route option selection stage that were all then at the same level of maturity, that all used a common set of assumptions, and that we were satisfied were robust for making the decision that we were going to make. I think it is fair to say that these costs will continue to mature over time. That's the nature of the project that we're involved in, and we will continue to review how those costs sort of influence the decisions that we're taking. Probably one other thing, it applies consistently to all routes, but also just worth noting that the price base for the route option report, the selection report, was at 2019 prices, whereas the consultation prices were 2015. But that will have had a consistent effect on all the prices, but it was just for sort of completeness.
So your 15 factors, were they all weighted equally, or was cost, did that have a heavier weighting?
So what we said was that we looked at those costs that were most likely to differentiate between the routes, and we put, I think, in the consultation doc, those factors, of which cost was one. I think there were 5 of them overall, where we thought differentiation was most likely to happen.
Yeah, sorry, that wasn't the question. The question was about the weighting of the 15 factors, because in my experience of dealing with public sector projects, cost is given a heavier weighting than other factors. And clearly, if there's such a massive swing in the cost between pre-consultation and post-consultation, that will have a massive impact on the selection because of that weighting factor. So the question was the weighting for the costs more than the other 14 factors?
So look, in terms of weighting, we said that those routes that were those factors that were most likely to differentiate were the ones that we were looking at in particular. And in terms of the weighting, we did set that out in the preferred route option report, and cost definitely was a factor that was considered in our decision.
It was a heavier weight then, is what I hear from that answer. Is that right? It's a yes or no answer, by the way.
So was it the heaviest weight? It was one of a set of 5 factors that were most differentiating that we were taking into account. So
it was weighted heavier than the others, yeah?
It wasn't weighted heavier than all the others. No, that's not what I've said. But okay. It is one of 5 factors that we saw as differentiating that we put particular weight on.
Okay. Why weren't those changes communicated with the consultees, and why haven't you been transparent about what the construct of those costs were and what the bridge is between A and B? Because this is a massive decision, and Route E involves carving up irreparably a massive swathe of North Bedfordshire countryside. And you not being transparent and open about it when questioned just seems like, I mean, if there is a justification and the scores are okay, then why not just be open about it? I don't get it.
Yeah, and I think we've said, you know, we've got a consultation forthcoming. We'll be setting out more detail on the cost analysis.
I mean about the previous consultation, not the
one. So we'll be setting out the cost information that went into in more detail that went into the consultation document and the preferred route option report.
For the other 4 routes as well.
Yes, so the full cost information for the routes. For all 5 routes, yeah.
Okay. So why was it heavier on detail route E pre-consultation than the other 4 routes? Then you said that you had a better maturity of the cost profile in route E.
So that was really about, as we were looking at what the route options might be. Route E was one of those ones where we took the view, we were looking at what the potential options were, and you know, there was a consideration of, should we serve Camborne, how would that work, and therefore that was when we constructed that route, you know, that the costs weren't to the same level of maturity, so it was a route that was developed a little bit later. So
yeah, but the question was, why is that? I mean, is it because it was one of the favoured routes of certain influencing bodies, or?
No, look, we particularly heard from people that Camborne was an option we should be looking at, and as we began to look at what those routes were, it felt to us that that route, you know, that a route that did broadly the sort of trace that route E did wasn't represented, so we sought to get that developed up.
Okay. Interesting. We'll come on to the route E consultation people later, I guess, because if that's the case, then you certainly weren't focused in your communications about the consultation on the people in route E, but we'll cover that later. So you mentioned Camborne a couple of times, and actually one of the logical things would have been to split the consultation kind of west and east of the A1 stroke the East Midlands main line, because actually the impact is quite different, and the feedback you got from the guys in Cambridgeshire have influenced what the selection is for the route in Bedfordshire. So how was route B assessed as cheaper than route E in 2019, but then more expensive following the consultation, when most of the factors remain the same, but route B does not have the expense of re-engineering Bedford Station, nor the complex task of tackling the North Bedfordshire topography?
So look, you know, again, when we set out the costs, you know, some of this will become more apparent, but route B, you know, in terms of the points that I've made about the viaducts, the point that I've made about the sort of reuse of earthworks materials, that had more impact on route B than it did on route E, and also, as I've said, the maturity of E was lower, but caught up over the course of the you know, further cost work that we were doing.
So if it's okay at this stage, Mike, I want to just move on, but I can see in the chat box there's one question that I might just pull out, which is from, it says iPad, but I think I know that's Councillor Field Foster now from our earlier session, Will. Alison, did you want to just ask your question? It does relate to something that Mike just raised and Will was answering on. I don't know if Alison, you're on mute. If not, I can ask it for Alison, which is, well, the question is,
sorry.
Oh, there you are, Alison. Yes, thank you. Please go ahead.
Sorry, I was just trying to get back. Well, what were the objections to the Bassingbourne connection, please?
I mean, this is slightly testing my memory. In terms of Bassingbourne, you know, when we looked at the options, yes, there were concerns, for example, around Wimpole Hall and those sorts of things, and the sort of environmental impacts. but also when we looked at the overall difference between those routes that served Bassingbourn and other routes, you know, the overall balance of the factors pushed you towards route E. But as you know, you're right to say there were concerns about sort of Wimpole Hall and other environmental factors around Bassingbourn.
Okay.
I've got one last one, if that's all right.
Quickly then, Mike, and then we'll move to Steve, who has some questions on freight.
In-out style of service is something that Bedford passengers are familiar with. We use it on the Thameslink service and we use it on the Bedford to Bletchley line services. You stated EWR were not persuaded by such a service at one of the events. So clearly that insinuates that you've looked into it with some form of feasibility study and analysis. Can you share that and share what the reasons were you weren't persuaded?
So, you know, I think, well, there's a couple of factors. The first thing is that, you know, these reversing moves are operationally relatively complex. They also quite significantly add to journey times. And those journey times obviously affect passengers going from, you know, Oxford through to Cambridge, you know, as well as people traveling, you know, sort of from the stations in between. And when you look at that impact on journey time, you know, as well as, you know, some of the cost impacts and the operational challenges, you know, it does begin to significantly impact the benefits you get from the railway.
How does the journey time compare with the extra distance that you're putting on by going through the northern route?
So there is a, you know, I'll need to refresh my memory, but I think the amount of journey time is quite materially different in terms of going in and coming out to the south of Bedford.
Okay. We're not convinced on that. We think the turnaround can be quite quick, particularly with only 3 carriages. It's not very far for them to walk.
Well, I think if Will's got the numbers, that he'll be able to send them to us later. But we can come back, Mike, on some point. Steve and Will, can we move on to some questions about freight? Steve.
Yes, thank you, Richard. Evening, Will. Good to see you again. We've had some correspondence fairly recently with East West Rail about freight, and I've had a reply from you about, or from the company anyway, about that in the last week or so. Just to follow up a bit on a couple of things relating to freight then. First of all, it's fairly widely recognised that freight's going to be a key component on this section of East West Rail. It's been mentioned by in the recent Peloton webinars, for example, by EEH, by the Rail Freight Group, even by the Minister himself. But it was barely mentioned in the consultations that East West Rail conducted in 2019 and again in 2020, and in fact, quite significantly downplayed by East West Rail representatives at the public exhibitions when questioned about it. It's never been one of the 5 main evaluation criteria for deciding on the appropriateness of the route. But in your recent reply, you've indicated that East West Rail will continue to back-check your decisions at appropriate points to ensure any new information is taken into account to confirm that Route E remains appropriate. And you will continue to do that all the way up to the DCO application going to the Secretary of State. I mean, you may be familiar with the text that I've received. Now then, given the implications of freight for extra engineering complexity, construction costs and environmental impact, would you think it right that the consultation, 2019 consultation, should be reopened into all route options so that the choice of route corridor can be properly informed by a freight study, which I understand East West Rail are currently undertaking? Wouldn't that be the right thing to do?
So, you know, so considering freight is one of our 15 assessment factors, we didn't really see it as a significantly differentiating factor between the route options, and we are, you know, the railway is designed to be sort of freight capable. But I think, you know, as we've said before, we are currently doing a piece of work look at what the sort of likely freight demand is, because in a lot of these instances, it is, they don't tend to work quite like passenger services, you'll be well aware. They tend to operate on an open access basis. So consequently, a sort of freight demand and understanding what that demand is likely to be is quite important. And we're trying to understand that in a bit more detail. Also, one of the things that is quite material in terms of how much freight is likely to use East West Rail is the ability for freight to get to and from the East West Rail infrastructure, not simply the use of the infrastructure itself. So I think those are things that we continue to work on. We'll set out a bit more detail at the consultation that is forthcoming, and we'll again continue to mature that position on freight, because you do have to take into account, as I've noted, the demand levels, the infrastructure levels, and how these things sort of come together. But as I say, we didn't see this as sort of significantly differentiated between the routes.
I think it'd be fair to say that circumstances have changed a bit since maybe the 2019 consultation was carried out. And there's a fair understanding, I think, that rail passenger demand will not recover to the levels that they were pre-pandemic. So freight is going to be a nice source of replacement income, shall we say, for the railway network. And it's clear that this is a strategic link in the midstream between the North London line and the line up to Nuneaton. It defies logic to say that this will not be an attractive freight route. And in those circumstances, can you see any situation in which East West Rail would say, no, we've got it wrong on Route E. There are better routes for freight than coming through a pretty hilly terrain north of Bedford?
So look, we've said all along, if new information comes to light that leads us to reconsider, then that is obviously something that we would do. We need to continue to do that. At present, that isn't the case. But obviously, if our analysis takes us somewhere, then we will obviously look at it, because ultimately, I want us to be building this railway in the right place. And if the analysis is pointing in a different direction, the analysis points in a different direction. But at the moment, I haven't seen anything on freight that would suggest Route E is not the right option.
Could I just finalise by saying, is that because you're engineering the route in such a way that the normal maximum gradients for freight trains are going to be set aside in favour of more challenging gradients, and therefore the route will not be so attractive for freight operators?
No, I think we are. I think we're applying, we're building freight capable infrastructure. That's what that's the requirement we've been set by the department. But we're obviously doing that, in line with the sort of standards that are set. Okay,
so you're not ruling out the possibility of a 1 in 80 gradient rather than a 1 in 125 gradient for freight?
So again, I'll need to remind myself as to what gradients that we're operating to, but our aim is to build a freight capable railway.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much, Will.
Thank you, and thank you, Steve. Well, we're going to ask some questions now on decision process, which Brent is going to ask. These will relate to, I think, primarily the original consultation process in 2019, the early part of 2019. Brent.
Thanks, Richard. Evening, Will.
Hi, Brent.
Will, East West Rail held a consultation on the identified route options between the 28th of January and the 11th of March 2019. What was the geographic spread by postcode of responses from, first of all, the general public, and secondly, interest groups?
So I don't have the full numbers to hand, but I do know we got a pretty good spread, and I know we got responses from certainly whether it's the MK41 postcode or so we got a range of responses. I know we got responses from a number of parish councils in the area, whether that's Ravensden or Brickhill. I know that other parish councils like Clapham discussed the consultation sort of from their minutes. So I do know that people were sort of actively engaged, and we were doing public events, we were advertising, we were genuinely doing as much as we can to raise the profile of the consultation.
I don't think that's good enough, Will. I don't think a pretty good response from the strategy director of East West Rail, who should have his fingers on all the facts and figures, is good enough. So my question was, what was the geographic spread by postcode of responses from A, the general public, and B, interest groups? Are you telling me you haven't got those figures?
Well, I think what I'm saying to you is I don't have them off the top of my head, but I genuinely don't have a problem with sharing the data where we've got it by postcode. The one thing I would say is I do know that less than 50% of people, when they responded, gave us their postcode. So there is a degree to which we've got to, you need to look at the data in that context.
I'm sorry, Will, that's an absolutely useless answer. I'm sorry to be so combative with you. I don't mean to be rude. Yeah. But you saying that this information on where the responses came from wasn't recorded. So all of the responses could have come from one small area in Cambridge.
No, that's not what I said. Let's just be really clear.
What did you say?
What I said was, when the general public responded to us, fewer than 50% gave us their postcode. That's not within our control.
I think
of the remaining 50% that did provide us with their postcode, I don't really see there's a problem with us sharing that data with you. I just don't happen to have that off the top of my head.
So we're literally talking about a few hundred people that you know where they actually came from, where they responded from. Only a few hundred, you don't know the rest. And as for not having the data off the top of your head, Will, come on, you must have this at your fingertips.
I think it's fair, Brent. If Will may not have that directly, and perhaps on responses it's harder than on other aspects of that, but he will provide us. I think Will said he'll send the information as he can.
Okay, thank you, Richard. So Will, you're going to send us the information on the 50%. How do you know that the other 50% were from genuine people in the affected? How do you know they weren't from Scotland, the Orkney Islands? How do you know that you got a good response from people in the affected area?
So look, we got a good response overall, and we draw, we take the consultation responses that we get, we process the information where people make meaningful responses. That's what we did. And as I say, we got, again, good responses from parish councils in the area, from local authorities in the area. So I think I am satisfied that we got a good level of response to the consultation.
I'm afraid, Will, that your level of satisfaction is very much lower than my own. For instance, my own parish council, we weren't consulted.
And which parish council is that?
Wilden. If you look through the appendix, you'll see we weren't consulted.
As I let me take that away. I do know we had a consultation zone that was based upon the route option area, so we applied that. We messaged, we made sure there was mail shots to that group of people. We did plenty of public engagement events. So we did a full set of activity.
I would dispute that, Will, as the consultation events for Route E, none of them were in Route E. So how could we go to them? Anyway, let's move on from that. Let's see. So from those that expressed support for a particular route, A, B, C, D, E, how did this break down between the 5 options? A got so many, B got so many, etc.
So if you look at the consultation responses, if you look at the consultation response form, the way that people responded was they told us how they thought on a scale of 1 to 5, the route options performed against a set of the factors that were there, and that is one of the things that that then allowed us to form a picture of how each of the route options was performing against each of those factors. So there wasn't a single question that said pick A through to E.
But you're saying that route E was the most popular based on this.
So when we look at the performance on all the factors, and we look at the average scores that the routes got across those factors, then it was clear that route E came through that with higher average scores.
Okay, so you're saying route E came through with higher average scores. You must have ranked them A, B, C, D, E in ranking, and you must have had a weighting for each one. So that's what I'm after from you, Will. What's the weighting, taking into effect all the various myriad factors that you mentioned that made route E the most popular? What was the differential? If you ended up with scores out of 100, did route E get 80 or 20 or what?
So I'm not. Perhaps I'm being slow. I'm not quite following.
Okay, speed up, Will. Keep up. We haven't got long.
Yeah, but let's just keep it on a friendly basis. I think if I'm telling Brent correctly, Brent, correct me if I'm wrong, but well, I think the question is when the weightings were done, what was the differential in terms of outcome for A versus B versus C versus D versus E? Was one a very clear winner? Was it all fairly close? That's, I think, the
no, fair enough. Again, we can let me go back to the data to make sure I'm telling you correctly. But I think E was, it wasn't that they were all precisely on a level. I think E was, performing on almost all of the factors, sort of at the upper end of the spectrum. I don't think it was marginal. Is my recollection, but again, I can confirm that for you.
Well, I just think. I think it might be helpful. You've kindly said that the distribution of 50% where you have their postcodes you can share, and if you could share that, and then the final outcome of I'm sure all the details are important, but maybe the outcomes that help would clarify. I think give people some sense of what you're saying. That would be very helpful.
I'd certainly be interested in the 50% that you don't know about, Will. You don't know where they come from, whether they come from the Isle of Arran or even in this country. I'd be interested what theirs were. But anyway, we'll leave that. Okay, Will, moving on to the postcards.
Hold on, please. At the moment, I know those who are not on mic and others, just stay off for a moment because this is Brent's time. Let's Brent have his questions, then we'll come back to you, Mike, certainly at the end.
This is my 15 minutes of fame, Mike. Okay, Will, you told us that you sent out 120,000 postcards.
Yeah.
What postcode distribution did East West Rail use for the distribution of the postcards? So you said they were sent to affected stakeholders.
So what we do, and this is sort of standard practice, is we send the sort of what's known as a shapefile, which is the consultation zone that we have. Royal Mail then give us the number of addresses, and we ensure that we deliver that number of postcards to the Royal Mail to then distribute. So we don't actually get the postcode breakdown.
So you said to the consultation zone to affected people. So if you're saying it's a shapefile, which I assume is a squiggle on an e-map, can you give us that shapefile?
I can't see any reason why not. I think we have. Let me check if there's a reason why not. But I think we published what our consultation zone was. So I think I think we've been transparent about that.
Yeah, you published what the consultation zone was, but you don't say which parts of that consultation zone you sent postcards to. And a lot of people are saying they didn't get one of these Dear Occupier postcards. But
what we did certainly what we gave to the Royal Mail was the full consultation zone, and they gave us a number of addresses inside that zone and delivered to those addresses.
Okay, well, so Royal Mail gave you a list of addresses?
No. They gave us the number of addresses. We then supply to them that number of postcards, which is what they then deliver.
So you didn't say to them exactly where are you sending these postcards?
But that's why we gave them the shapefile.
Okay. Can we have the shapefile, please? And then we can, with your permission, ask Royal Mail whereabouts they sent the postcards to, because this is very much a controversial subject with so many people saying they didn't get one. It would clear up a lot of the grey area.
Well, so we've been transparent about the consultation zone. Let me check on sharing the shapefile, but my inclination is to be as sort of transparent on this as possible. So I can't see why not. That would
be good. What sort of timescale are we working on there, Will?
Well, I think we have to give him time to do that, Brent. So let's not press Will on fire. He said he's going to provide that information.
I've got one last point, Richard, and then I'll leave you to it. It's a very quick one. Will, you said on your next consultation within the next 2 weeks on Route E, you're going to give costings information for all the 5 routes, the way they've matured. So will we get that in the next 2 weeks?
So we're going to be releasing, the set of cost data that we've got in relation to the consultations that we've already held. So yeah, that's going to be going, as I say, at the same time as the consultation that's coming, I say, in the next couple of weeks.
Thank you very much, Will.
And thank you, Brent.
Thank you.
Will, thank you for that. We're going to have some questions on engineering from Peter. Peter, do you want to put your questions to Will?
Good evening, Will. Peter Norris. Can you just clarify for me something that's still puzzling me? I understand that when the routes were announced, some information was provided to made available. Bedford Borough were given costings for the various routes, including Route E, which were based on a gradient of 1 in 125 to account for freight. Were these figures produced by East West Rail, or did they come from Network Rail, these cost estimates?
So I think going back to the time, they would have been at consultation, they would have been based on Network Rail cost estimates.
Yeah, so it would be Network Rail that applied the 1 in 125 gradient limit for freight capability.
I would, yeah, yes.
At the same time, within the technical briefing document, where you address the operational objective of satisfying existing and future freight demand as it might develop, you introduced you noted that they were based on a maximum grade of 1 in 125, but you also said that we will reduce whether costs could be reduced by increasing the maximum gradient to 1 in 80. A steeper gradient could be a constraint for heavy haul freight, but will still provide capability for lighter freight. The implications of this will need to be considered further in the context of the national freight strategy. Will be evidence-led, and we will consider any likely changes. And that's consistent with what you said earlier in your presentation this evening. But you were faced with a strong bid from Bedford to favour Route E, which had effectively a built-in requirement to exploit a steeper gradient because of the topography, particularly in the Clapham area. And there seems to have been several rounds of the cost drivers being modified, which enabled Bedford to come up with the aid of their consultants with a value engineered solution which avoided significant infrastructure which was originally envisaged in order to comply with the 1 in 125 gradient. And in doing so, they identified a route which largely avoided rivers, bridges over rivers, the Great Ouse, and against that costs were estimated, and there was an estimated saving of £54 million in the Clapham area for doing that.
Peter, could you, just in the interest of time, could you focus to a particular question for Will so he can respond to it? Because you're giving a lot of context, which is helpful.
Yeah. What? Well, how will you be able to back check on your figures if it turns out that the freight requirement does require a more gentle gradient, but we've already committed to a route which can't do better than 1 in 80?
So look, if as I've always said, if new information comes to light, then we will take that into, we will take that into account. We will have it. We've got a back checking process that does that for sure. One of the things that I do think is right that we do is look to, where we are, making very expensive provision that is, unlikely to be used, because the taxpayer shouldn't pay more for constructing railways than they need to. And we are, one of the reasons we are set up is to find ways to challenge costs and to bring costs down, because we want to demonstrate that it is possible to do that. And so, the one thing I would say is that the approaches that we've applied to all routes are consistent in the gradients that we've we've designed to. I think the other thing just that is worth saying is, whatever the work done by Bedford, the costs are based upon a set of designs that we've built, and they're costs that were prepared either by us or for us, from Network Rail or from others. But we haven't been relying on a Bedford Borough Council design or a Bedford Borough Council cost.
Okay, understood. Are you aware of any particular constraint in the Clapham area which has caused you to make contact with the Anglia Water Authority over possible conflictions with their installations?
So I do know that we are in active conversations with Anglia Water in terms of surveys and in terms of sort of their land and where alignments might engage with their land. I must say, I personally don't have any more details than that.
Yeah, so you can't confirm whether or not that's likely to produce a step increase in the actual cost of the project for reasons that weren't maybe apparent at the time the decision was made.
At this point, I'm not, no, but I don't know whether conversations are happening elsewhere in the business in more detail on that, but I'm not aware.
Have your costings looked at the whole life model for this railway, the ongoing costs, which might be more in one respect than another?
Yes. So as we build our our view of this railway, and we look at our full assessment factors, they do get into what the long-term operating and maintenance costs will be.
So in particular with Route E, which by its nature requires the train to rise to a significant height on every trip. To be precise, it's in the order of 27 meters, more than any of the other routes would have required to gain altitude. This obviously will come with an ongoing cost in terms of energy expended on every trip. To what extent has that been costed into your long-term figures? So
we are doing, and I think in the evidence presented in the consultation documents, we are looking at what the long-term operating and maintenance costs will be. So we are taking that into account.
I know that you're not ready to announce a date for the particular alignments being revealed to the public. But can we safely assume that they will be within the corridors that you have advertised?
So they're going to be broadly in the option E area. I think we have said, for example, that we are looking at a station option north of Camborne, which is marginally outside the option E area. We've said that publicly, so there may be minor deviations, but the vast majority.
Specifically, mean the route, the fan above Bedford. You agree there's a certain amount of fuzziness around the edges of it. It's not a precise pencil line, but you've no plans at the moment to go outside that particular corridor.
No, as I say, we're in that broad area. Yeah.
It has been said that there may be intentions to establish maybe a partway station between Brickhill and Twinwoods.
I think the one thing I can certainly tell you is, well, I need to be careful I don't step over the line of once I say one thing about the consultation, I say more, because we are still going through all the necessary approvals, but we're not going to be consulting on a station in that area.
Okay. How long do you expect this line to rely on diesel electric power?
On diesel or electric? Sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
I said diesel electric. Diesel electric, where it generates its own electricity on its way.
Yeah, no, fair enough. So we are look. We are looking at what the full range of options are for traction power. We want to be a net zero carbon railway. We're looking. There's a set of ways that you could do that. Overhead line electrification is one of them. Mm-hmm. A sort of battery hybrid option is also doable, because that would reduce the amount of overhead line that you need, and that might in turn reduce the costs and lead to an overall better solution. So we're looking at the full range of options for what the traction power should be at the moment. But we're
on the basis then that it will be unlikely to get battery assistance for a freight train. The long-term prognosis for freight carriages by diesel electric power, unless it's electrified.
So, and that's why we're looking at the full range of options, because there are arguments for why full electrification is better than discontinuous. There's a full set of arguments that we're looking at the moment.
Peter, can I?
Thank you. Yes, I think I'm.
I just didn't. I want to be able to pass back to Mike, because Mike's our sort of repertoire for questions that ought to be asked. And whilst Mike's doing, have a quick look through the questions in the chat box that Mike doesn't pick up, and see if we have time for that.
Thank you.
Mike, you're on mute, by the way, Mike.
Favourite phrase of 2020 here. Look, one thing, I am a resident of Brickhill. There's been quite a lot of fuss at Brickhill Parish Council. We managed to get a vote to overturn their support for Route E this week. Fat chance of that making any difference, I guess, at this stage. But they did not consult with residents. It was basically a decision made unilaterally, and they now understand that that was a mistake. So I can say that. So going back to the responses, how many responses did you get, as opposed to people turn up at from citizens, I guess? Was it about, I think it was about 3,500, is that right?
So there were, I think the total number is just over 7,000. And then there's a sort of breakdown of those where some people were sort of providing individually tailored responses, some people were providing sort of more petition type responses.
Okay, and that was out of a total population of something over 300,000.
So obviously within the consultation zone, we went to 1,200 addresses. Sorry, not 1,200. Just over 100,000 addresses.
So yeah, average of 2.5 people are home, something over 300,000. So we're approaching 300,000. Yeah. So so that was less than 10%. Sorry, less than 2% in terms of written responses. So I'm wondering how significant that is. The other thing is, you said quite openly that you're trying to be transparent, but we know of many freedom of information requests, some of which are the same questions as you've been asked tonight: access to the shapefile, postcodes, who was consulted, things like that, where we just get answers that just don't answer the question. We feel that actually the policy is not to be transparent when questioned. That's what comes over. You mentioned net zero carbon. The northern route is longer, takes steeper gradients and more curves, all of which means more material to build it, more energy to drive whatever the train is, regardless, whether it's electric or diesel traction, doesn't matter, it still takes more. How can you reconcile that with the target to be net zero carbon? And quite a few people have put in the comments here.
Would you want to just get the answer to that first, rather than
go on.
up the part? So, would you want to just answer that last question about the environmental impact?
Yeah. So look, we look at the environmental impact sort of in the round. So there's a set of sort of environmental factors we take into account. Net zero carbon is, of course, one of them. And I think look, I'm not the engineer, but I think we are satisfied that it is possible to sort of have a realistic ambition to be net zero carbon, and we think that is possible on Route E.
But would be easier with the other routes. Which brings me to the question on here, which is why was the use of the A421 corridor not one of the options? It's relatively level. It's an existing transport corridor, and therefore in line with government policy on transport networks.
Yeah, I think that was a question that was raised by Councillor Steve Moon. So maybe after Will's response, Steve, if you wanted to chip in something on that as well. But Will, why was the use of A421 corridor not one of the options?
So we alongside Network Rail developed the set of sort of 5 options. I think some combination of A and B do pick up the A421 in particular places, but the options we developed ultimately were the options that we developed. I do know in relation to some of the again, I'd need to go back to the sort of technical team on this, but I do know that when we look at sort of particular sort of road characteristics, some of them are sort of work well in terms of their interaction with railways. Others, they do have quite different characteristics in terms of the gradients that they use, in terms of how straight they are, and those sorts of things. So, but I do know we certainly did look at what the full range of options were. Some of it, sort of even before we got to the set of 5, and we do set out a sort of journey that we went on even to get to the 5 route option areas in the consultation documents that we've provided, and the reasons we got to the options that we did.
Okay, that's Councillor Moon. Did you have a follow-up on that?
Yeah, thank you, Richard, if you would. 2 issues really arise out of that. One is both the 421 and Route A initially are not only much more level in the main and involve far less engineering challenges than I think the Route E does. In particular, they don't have the same impact on villages in a way that Route E inevitably is going to have. And both of them skirt villages and particularly the A421 skirt villages rather than go close to them. It does seem to me that very little weighting has been given to the impact on villages and their amenities, and really just the whole feel of those villages. Some of them simply won't survive this, in my judgment. Wilden, I think, is a particular candidate to be very adversely affected. Can you therefore indicate why you would say that the 421 or Route A have been discounted, taking that into account? Or to what extent, in other words, did you give any weighting to avoiding rather than crashing past villages?
So I don't want to sound like a stuck record. We obviously looked at things across a range of sort of 15 assessment factors, but we certainly do take into account, the impact upon the environment, the impact upon existing communities. We're doing everything we possibly can to avoid, impact on existing residential areas and communities. So we definitely do take that into account, but we look at it in the round in terms of the 15 assessment factors, but it is definitely a factor we take into account.
Richard, can I ask a different question, but it follows up from something Mike asked and I don't think got an answer.
Okay, please do. Yes, we have a few
and it's
more minutes
really
left.
why the routes, in particular Route E, is being dealt with as a single entity rather than being Bedford to Tempsford and then Tempsford to Cambridge. There are very different criteria for each side, very different considerations, and clearly, given the narrow span of the narrow window really you've got around Tempsford, is going to come into it one way or the other and going out from there one way or the other. You could easily have split those into two issues, into two separate consultations. And that would have made it much easier to focus on the issues that affect certainly our side, which is Bedford to Tempsford. Is there any reason why that wasn't done and why it still couldn't be done?
But I think when you look at the route options in the consultation, there were all the permutations are there, so it's not like there weren't permutations that we didn't have that weren't available by splitting it. So I do think the route options did provide all the all the permutations that we talk about. Because when you look at sort of B versus E, D, the role of where C features as well. So across all the options, I think all the permutations are there.
Okay, thanks. Well, just in the interest of, I've got one other question I can see in the chat, which I just posed. In the interest, I'll pose it because rather than go around, and then I'll go just finally back to Mike in case there's a final question. But this question is from Councillor Field Foster, and I think she has a number of points. But the first point was, did East West Rail see the Bedford Borough Council consultants, which is Kilburn Consulting's engineering report in February 2019?
So I do know that that Kilburn prepared a report that was Bedford Borough Council's sort of response to the consultation. So we saw that, and I think we published that in our sort of summary of consultation responses when we responded to consultation. I think I'm not quite sure of the sort of specific report that's being sort of talked about and whether it was sort of submitted to us, but I do know there was a Kilburn consulting report that was basically Bedford Borough Council's response that we have seen, and that I say that we ourselves have published.
Alison, was there anything further on that you?
Yes, I would. There were two reports prepared by Kilburn Consulting for Bedford Borough Council. One was submitted to Bedford Borough Council in February 2019, and that report recommended Route A. It also recommended an alternate route, which was the old Varsity line. It wasn't one of your 5 consultation routes, but I'm just wondering if you had sight of that report and whether you considered the old Varsity route.
So in terms of the Kilburn consulting report, I say the one that I'm aware of is the one that was Bedford Borough Council's consultation response. In terms of the old Varsity route, there were a number of factors for why the old Varsity route wasn't necessarily appropriate. In some places it has been built over, whether that's the observatory at the Cambridge end, also the some of the sort of old embankments and cuttings and those sort of physical features of the railway have become sort of now priority habitats from a sort of nature and environmental perspective. And also, part of the considerations here as well, when we were looking at sort of route options, were those routes that serve places in terms of economic growth and the opportunity for, for sort of homes and new communities. And so some of the route options that we put on the table, we concluded were better on that basis.
Can I just come back with one more final thing, please, Will? I would like to know if you could possibly get back to us whether you had sight of that February 2019 report, please, because it did not recommend Route E.
Or D. So I'll send you the report, Will. But let me just read a bit from it. It says,
well, actually, Mike, we're right up against time, and I hate to be a stickler, but Brent has got his hand up, and I think that's a new hand, Brent. So I think I'm going to give the last question, if I can, Mike, to Brent. Will be coming back on the point that Councillor Phil Foster raised, but Brent, you get the last question.
Thank you very much, Richard. Will, you said 2 weeks ago in one of these perpetual Zoom meetings that we keep having that you weren't ignoring local concerns from residents along Route E, and that you're in dialogue with a group of stakeholders near Cambridge. Are you now reconsidering the Cambridge end, or is Route E completely set in stone?
So, we're obviously going to be going out with alignments that reflect, options in the broad area of Route E, as we've said. As I've noted, there are options, that we've been looking at, which serve a station to the north of Camborne. We do know that there are representations at the Cambridge end around the approach into Cambridge. We've heard those representations, and we'll be setting out in the consultation, our position. But I at the moment haven't seen anything that's led me to change the conclusions that we've drawn.
So you said the broad area of Route E, Will. Are you considering leaving at all the area of Route E?
Yes, so we've made clear that we have been looking at options that serve Camborne North. Well,
I have to say, Will, that if you are saying that you're in dialogue with a set of stakeholders about moving outside of Route E, you're looking at a group of stakeholders. We'd like to talk to you about changing the route outside Route E as well.
So, I've been having the dialogue with them, that is events like this where Anthony Brown, the local MP, has set up for people to make presentations or ask questions, or that's if people want to make representations to us, then I've always been open to that. But as I say,
you're actually listening to them, Will. You are saying, because they've represented to you, that you will consider going outside of Route E. We want that same consideration, please.
But look, we will set out in consultation the approach that we've taken. But when people make representations to us, we definitely do listen.
Well, are you listening to us? Well, we'd like to go outside of Route E as well.
I think Will's said it a couple of times, Brent, maybe not to your satisfaction, but Will has said he is listening and he is open to, I think, perhaps Cambridge had a specific proposal about it, I don't know. But maybe this is something that Will can sort of follow up and say how that engagement might go further after the call. But I think for the purposes of trying to stick to our time frame and being fair to everyone, first of all, I'd like to thank the parish councillors and borough councillors on the call and for their questions. Particularly like to thank the questioners and, of course, to Will Gallagher from East West Rail for the conversation. So thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Will, and thank you, Richard.
Richard.
for
Brilliant.